I can still remember the day when I sat across from myself, caught in a quiet room with nothing but my own thoughts echoing loudly. It was one of those moments where time seemed to pause, and I was forced to confront something deeply unsettling. Not external, but a cycle spinning within me, shaping each decision, each hesitation, each tiny surrender. I realized then that I hadn't been truly neutral about my finances, nor about the choices that led me here. I was at a crossroads, and I had no doubt. If I didn't break the pattern, the story would just keep repeating itself, like a loop I hadn't yet learned to escape. I had spent years thinking I was simply unlucky or that opportunity had slipped through my fingers for reasons outside my control. But as I sat there, a quiet voice inside me whispered a different truth. Every moment I postponed change was not just a delay, it was a choice. Unconscious, yes, but a choice all the same. The puzzle pieces began to fall into place. It wasn't just about the numbers in the bank account or the external circumstances I blamed. It was about the invisible cycle holding me hostage from moving forward. The weight of that realization was both terrifying and oddly relieving. I wasn't a passive victim. I was an active participant in this mental dance that dictated how much I dared to dream, how much I allowed myself to earn, and how much risk I was willing to take. Suddenly, the blurry margin between fear and safety wasn't a concept anymore. It was a living, breathing part of my psyche dictating my financial reality. I could almost see the invisible chains tightening each time I told myself, later, it's not the right time. But deep down, I wondered, what if that later never came? There's a strange kind of comfort in pretending that things will simply work out if I just wait a little longer. I think many of us live in that space, a place shaded by denial, where procrastination dulls the edges of our financial anxiety. It's easy to convince ourselves there's neutrality, that we're just waiting or being cautious, when in reality, every moment of indecision is a brick in the wall that keeps us stuck. Do you ever feel that way? Like you're caught in a slow-moving current that pulls you back even as you try to swim forward? What struck me most was how unsuspecting I was of this powerful mental cycle until I stopped to examine it. It wasn't a dramatic event. It wasn't a sudden shock. It was subtle, like a whisper I refused to hear, a pattern so normalized I didn't recognize it as a barrier. And yet, that barrier was real. It decided far more than I had ever realized. It determined the ceiling on my income, the boundaries of my ambition, and the limits of my financial confidence. As I faced this truth, a quiet question settled in my mind. What if breaking this cycle wasn't just about changing habits or budgets, but about changing myself, my mindset, my emotional responses, the stories I told myself about money? What if the hero of my financial journey wasn't external luck or the right opportunity, but a choice I made inside my own mind? Not someday, but right now? I want to be honest with you. As I was with myself, this isn't easy. The weight of what if can feel crushing. Facing that cycle means standing in the light of all those avoided truths, fear, guilt, insecurity, and sometimes shame. There's no neutrality here. To remain passive is to choose repetition. To step forward is to choose transformation. It's a decision every moment asks of us, whether we realize it or not. And yet, it's also a space where our power lies. This exact moment, this very choice, is where the old story can end and a new one can begin. So here we are, at this point of decision. This is the moment where the quiet internal cycle either gets acknowledged and broken or continues to silently steer our financial lives without our conscious permission. And I want you to know, you're not alone in sitting with that tension. I've been there too, tangled in the paralysis of maybe later, only to realize that every later was a silent agreement to remain stuck. As you listen to these words, I invite you to consider what it feels like to stand at this crossroads, not in theory, but right now. What does it mean for you to step out of the shadows of unconscious repetition and into a clearer, more courageous space? This isn't just about money. It's about freedom, about reclaiming your power in the quiet decisions that shape your life daily. The journey ahead isn't about quick fixes or magic formulas. It's about facing a fundamental truth that most of us avoid. There's no safe middle ground in this internal battle. Either you choose to break the cycle today, or you continue to live by the script it writes for you. And that choice, your choice, is the beginning of everything. There was a day when a conversation with a close friend jolted me to a new level of awareness. He asked, "Why do you keep telling yourself to wait until the perfect time?" At first, I shrugged it off, but his question lingered like a persistent echo. It dawned on me that this habit of waiting wasn't merely a harmless pause. It was shaping a silent inertia within me, stalling forward momentum. The repeated pattern of holding back had transformed into its own kind of gravitational pull, dragging me deeper into hesitation. That moment felt less like casual advice and more like a mirror held up to an unconscious agreement I had made with fear itself. Reflecting on this, I recognized that decisions delayed indefinitely don't simply vanish from existence. They accumulate, like snow piling higher and colder, forming walls in my mind. Each postponement erodes a bit more courage, creating a fortress of comfort where risk is unwelcome, and opportunity becomes a distant, unattainable echo. This mental barricade isn't visible to others, but inside me, it restricts movement with the subtlety of a spider's web. You might understand that sensation, where your mind feels caught, tethered by an unseen force coaxing you to hold still. During one evening walk, I found myself mulling over this tension between inertia and change. Picture this: snowflakes drifting lazily until they converge into a vast white field, smooth and still. My thoughts fell in a similar way, layers of avoidance settling over my resolve. The deeper realization was that those layers aren't obstacles simply to be pushed through. They are patterns ingrained from countless small choices accumulated over years. In recognizing that, I discovered that the battle isn't won by forcing movement alone, but by gently unraveling the reasons why stillness felt safer. What struck me forcibly was how these loops of hesitation aren't governed solely by logic, but by an internal narrative shaped long before I could fully understand it. Decisions about money, risk, and growth are tangled with feelings of identity and worthiness. In my own life, I found that instincts developed early, messages whispered between family members, cultural expectations, and personal vulnerabilities kept rewinding the same script. This constant replay is like a familiar song stuck on repeat, comforting yet limiting. For example, hearing phrases like, "money doesn't grow on trees," may seem trivial, but for me, they seeded uncertainty about abundance that steered my choices for decades. One afternoon, after journaling about these patterns, I faced a startling thought. What if this cycle is less of an adversary and more a guardian, a part of myself trying to protect me from risks that once felt overwhelming? This reframing shifted the dynamic. Instead of wrestling with the cycle, I could begin to listen for what it was trying to say. Could this ingrained caution be rooted in past experiences of scarcity or trauma? By giving that voice attention, I allowed space for compassion, which softened the grip it had on me. The process didn't erase fear overnight, but it transformed the relationship from battle to dialogue. When I glanced at my own behavior through this lens, patterns emerged clearly. An invitation to invest sparked anxiety not because of numbers or calculations, but because I sensed a risk to my internal sense of security. Similarly, moments of financial abundance often sparked an undercurrent of guilt, a shadow from past lessons internalized without critique. This internal conflict appeared as a tug-of-war beneath all rational plans, explaining why I repeatedly deferred decisions that could lead to growth. It was as if my mind dialed down hope to protect itself from potential disappointment. I remember a pivotal moment when I caught myself saying, "I don't deserve to succeed yet." This whispered belief acted like an anchor, dragging my ambitions down before they could rise. Acknowledging this was painful but necessary. It illuminated the complex interplay between self-esteem and financial risk, showing that hesitancy can mask deeper struggles with self-worth. Breaking this kind of self-limiting cycle demanded more than discipline. It required me to confront inner voices that had long operated in secrecy. Later that week, I sat in a quiet room, eyes closed, imagining the mental chains that held me back. They weren't iron links, but delicate threads spun of old fears and conditioned responses. Visualizing these fragile bonds allowed me to sense how breaking them wasn't about brute force, but mindful, consistent effort. Small acts of courage, making an intentional financial choice, setting boundaries with spending, voicing aspirations, became the first practical steps to unraveling tangles formed by decades of inaction. Now, Consider how this applies when you face your own crossroads. The challenge isn't only external circumstances or the timing of opportunities. It's the subtle but profound grip of habits birthed by years of unexamined decisions. Recognizing these inner influences invites a different kind of power, one rooted in self-awareness and the willingness to dialogue with parts of yourself that resist change. Imagine stepping into that dialogue as an ally, not an adversary, giving space for fears to be heard but not allowed to dictate the future. In understanding this, I began to see procrastination and hesitation less as faults and more as invitations to deeper exploration. If you've ever found yourself frozen at the edge of possibility, take a moment to listen closely. What is the quiet voice below your surface saying? Is it reminding you of old hurts, or guarding a part of you that feels vulnerable? Becoming fluent in these inner languages transforms the landscape of financial decision-making from a battlefield into a garden where new seeds of growth can take root. This shift is where the journey truly gains momentum, moving beyond surface actions into the heart of meaningful change. I recall a time when I found myself pacing late into the night, restless and tangled in thoughts I dared not voice aloud. It was as if an unseen director scripted my actions, molding my financial choices before I could even fully grasp their consequences. That night, I realized it wasn't merely hesitation at play. It was a deeply entrenched mental pattern dictating possibilities I failed to see. Like a drummer keeping a relentless beat, this pattern orchestrated the tempo of my life, establishing limits disguised as safety nets. I felt like a marionette tethered by invisible strings that pulsed with past fears and conditioned responses. One evening, a close friend challenged me with a simple question: "What keeps you locked in place?" It wasn't a call for quick answers, but a mirror reflecting my hidden truths. I had to admit, it was an internal blueprint forged long ago, an inescapable narrative growing roots beneath my confidence. This blueprint operated silently, channeling my choices into familiar grooves, even if those paths led to frustration or stagnation. Feeling those constraints was like standing inside a glass cage, aware of the outside world, yet unable to reach it fully. The next day, determined to understand this unseen architecture, I revisited journals from years prior. The patterns weren't just scattered thoughts. They formed a fortress reinforced by misbeliefs about worthiness and scarcity. Memories surfaced, times when financial decisions were made under duress or pressure, planting seeds of doubt that blossomed into chronic caution. It struck me how often I had mistaken these internal safety mechanisms for genuine protection. In truth, they functioned as barriers, quietly assuring my retreat whenever courage nudged me forward. Conversations with trusted mentors brought new perspectives, revealing that this mental framework wasn't unique to me. Many people unknowingly harbor similar scripts that limit their vision and decisions. One such mentor offered an analogy. Imagine a river blocked by a dam built from unresolved fears. The water wants to flow freely, but your dam holds it back, shaping the landscape upstream, but starving the lands beyond. I found the metaphor profound, recognizing that these inner barricades don't simply halt progress. They starve potential by withholding the flow of growth and opportunity. Later, I experimented with a practice that shifted the lens entirely. Instead of wrestling against this mental architecture, I imagined it as a map drawn by my subconscious. The map, though flawed, carried valuable clues, points where I'd previously stumbled, markers of lessons learned, and pathways requiring fresh courage. This reframing invited compassion toward myself, transforming self-recrimination into curiosity. What if the limitations weren't failures, but signposts signaling where my inner work was most urgent? This inquiry sparked the first threads of permission to explore new routes. One memorable afternoon, I attended a workshop designed to uncover hidden financial beliefs through guided visualization and storytelling. As I ventured into that exercise, I visualized a vast garden with walls built from old worries. Each brick represented fears like not enough, too risky, or undeserving. With gentle focus, I imagined myself removing bricks, one by one, feeling both vulnerability and liberation with each. The garden began to breathe, sunlight pouring in through gaps that had once seemed impenetrable. That image lingered long afterward, a metaphor for transforming mental obstacles into spaces ripe for growth. During those sessions, I confronted a surprising truth. Some of my protective stories stemmed from witnessing others' hardships, absorbing their anxiety as my own. A childhood conversation about financial struggle, overheard but never spoken of, had left an indelible imprint. I had buried those fears beneath layers of responsible behavior, unaware their grip tightened around my decisions. Recognizing intergenerational threads added nuance. These weren't solely my battles, but echoes of ancestral survival, asking for acknowledgement and healing. As these insights cascaded, I noticed an unexpected shift in my daily choices. When faced with a financial opportunity that once sparked hesitation, I instead paused to identify which old imprint might be activating resistance. That awareness allowed me to consciously decide whether that inner voice deserved the reins or if I was ready to pilot a new course. The practice didn't eliminate discomfort, but it gave me space to engage with it rather than react reflexively. Each choice became a deliberate dance between honoring caution and inviting possibility. Now, consider how this awareness might activate your own sense of agency when confronted with familiar patterns that limit your horizon. It's not about denying prior programming, but about becoming an active cartographer, redrawing the mental maps that guide your navigation. When the pull of old imprints tugs at your resolve, what if you approach those moments with questions rather than judgment? What stories are whispering in your mind, attempting to dictate the script? Bringing those narratives into focus illuminates new pathways that were once masked by automatic responses. This unfolding clarity also revealed a paradox. The mental architecture once rigid and confining could, with mindful attention, become a scaffolding supporting intentional transformation. Edges softened as I learned to channel ingrained caution into grounded risk-taking rather than paralysis. Instead of resisting internal restraints, I exchanged struggle for dialogue, inviting them to reveal deeper truths and guide wiser decisions. This approach turned resistance into allyship, a relationship marked by negotiation instead of confrontation. Ultimately, liberation emerged not from breaking chains through sheer force, but from cultivating awareness that illuminated choices previously made unconsciously. The mental patterns that once dominated my financial landscape became visible landmarks, helping me navigate with greater clarity and intention. It's as if the river that was dammed gradually found new channels, flowing with newfound energy toward an unseen but promising horizon. The journey continues, but for the first time, I hold the paddle firmly in my hands. It wasn't until a late autumn evening when I found myself seated on the worn bench of a quiet park, leaves crunching beneath my feet, that a realization unfolded in a way that surprised me. The cold air bit gently, reminding me of how exposed I felt inside, vulnerable to forces I hadn't yet confronted. My thoughts turned to the recurring decisions I delayed endlessly, each postponement knitting a tighter web of resistance. But at that moment, I noticed something new. Beneath the hesitation, a subtle craving for control had been quietly pulsing all along. Not control in the commanding sense, but a desperate need to steer outcomes amid uncertainty that life's unpredictability thrust upon me. That night, I began to grapple with the idea that avoidance wasn't solely grounded in fear or comfort-seeking. It was tethered intricately to a yearning for certainty and safety in a world swirling with variables beyond my grasp. Through this lens, it struck me how canceling action had served as an unconscious form of self-protection. Choosing to stay in the place of stasis acted like a soft cocoon woven with threads of familiarity and cautious hope. This truth hit me with the weight of a sudden thunderclap, a recognition that empowerment begins only when I loosen my grasp on the illusion of complete security. In the days that followed, I encountered a vivid metaphor during a therapy session that resonated deeply with this perception. My counselor spoke of a garden enclosed by hedges too thick to see through. Inside, certain flowers flourished, safe from predators and harsh weather. Yet, without venturing beyond the familiar enclosure, the garden's richness remained limited, the soil untended, new seeds unplanted. Drawing that image made me ask, was my reverence for predictability subtly sabotaging my capacity to nurture growth? More importantly, was I willing to cut back those dense borders and risk exposure to possibility? One afternoon, After sharing these reflections aloud, a friend responded with a story from her own life, how she once repeatedly declined job offers that challenged her comfort zone. I thought I was being prudent, she explained, but what I was really doing was shrinking my world to a safe, predictable bubble. Hearing her speak candidly about stepping beyond that wall sparked a flicker of hope inside me. I imagined what it would feel like to exchange fear's tight grip for a breath of fresh air, breathing in uncertainty with curiosity instead of dread. Though tempting to leap immediately, I reminded myself of patience. Transformation often unfolds in small, deliberate movements. I began experimenting with daily micro-decisions, saying yes to invitations that nudged me, setting modest financial goals that stretched my usual boundaries, and embracing the discomfort of unfamiliar conversations. Each act was like testing the water's temperature before diving in, inviting a delicate balance of caution and courage. Over time, these incremental experiences eroded my appetite for habitual withdrawal, replacing it with a growing appetite for expansive living. What truly surprised me during this phase was noticing how self-talk evolved. Where I used to dismiss myself with, "I can't handle change," a gentler voice emerged, whispering, "I'm learning to meet change with open palms." This shift wasn't mere optimism. It was rooted in tangible actions signaling that I could navigate unpredictability with resilience. To my astonishment, prospects I once avoided began unfolding before me, not always grandiose, but imbued with meaningful potential. It was as though embracing uncertainty had unlocked doors I didn't realize were closed. Then came the challenge, confronting old scripts that murmured doubts about my worthiness to claim such opportunities. On a blustery evening, I journaled through tears about the origins of self-imposed limitations, recalling family beliefs passed down with unintended sting. Yet, acknowledging those painful inheritances also became a source of strength. I started reframing inherited narratives into stories of survival and eventual triumph, rewriting the roles I assigned myself. This process felt like carefully untangling a knot tied long ago, setting the stage for new storylines where I am both author and hero. One memorable turning point arrived unexpectedly while volunteering at a local nonprofit. A conversation with a young woman struggling with career indecision mirrored my internal wrestlings. She said, "I keep waiting for everything to feel perfect before moving forward." Her words struck a chord, the shared human experience of hesitancy and the false allure of neutrality. As we spoke about embracing imperfections and uncertainties as catalysts rather than barriers, I sensed a profound kinship woven through our distinct paths. That interaction fortified my resolve. I realized courage is not the absence of fear, but its companion. Now, consider how this reflection's ripple may influence your own mindset when facing pivotal choices constrained by the desire for absolute assurance. Imagine welcoming the unknown as an energetic frontier, a canvas with infinite brushstrokes ready for your deliberate mark. What hidden aspirations lie dormant beneath your caution? What freedoms might blossom if you loosen the reins on predictability just enough to explore? Such thinking doesn't demand recklessness. Instead, it invites a conscious dance where you orchestrate momentum amidst chaos, embracing imperfection as a fertile ground for growth. This evolving perspective also unveiled a secret resource within myself: flexibility. Like a seasoned sailor adjusting sails with shifting winds, I learned to read internal currents, adjusting responses to flow rather than fight. Resistance softened as I saw setbacks not as failures handmaiden, but as signposts along uncharted routes. This awareness emboldened me to treat hesitant moments not as dead ends, but as pauses inviting recalibration, inviting me back to the helm with renewed intention. It was unexpected freedom born from surrendering the illusion of full control. Ultimately, these experiences taught me that breaking patterns isn't an act of sudden rupture, but an art of navigating complexity with grace. It demands befriending the uncomfortable, finding peace amid turbulence, and daring to set foot beyond fences built by cautious minds. As I sit here recalling those shifts, I'm reminded that transformation is alive in the spaces where certainty dissolves and curiosity takes root. It beckons us all to refuse neutrality, to decide consciously, to live abundantly in the rich spectrum between fear and hope. One afternoon, as I sifted through an old box of letters and photographs, a long-buried memory resurfaced, catching me off guard. I found a note from my younger self, scrawled in hurried handwriting. I will never take risks with money. It's safer to hold on tight. At first, the words felt familiar, almost comforting in their certainty. But looking closer, I sensed something different this time. A silent tremor beneath that conviction, a flicker of doubt that perhaps safety masqueraded as surrender. That moment ignited a new layer of understanding for me. It wasn't just a pattern clinging stubbornly to old fears. It was an elaborate defense system, intricately woven by repeated stories of scarcity and guardedness. What struck me was how deeply this system influenced not only actions, but the very way I interpreted possibility and trust. Trust in myself, in life's unfolding, and in the invisible currents steering my financial reality. As days passed, the illusion of an unwavering fortress began showing cracks. I recall sitting in a crowded cafe, listening to a stranger recount her venture into entrepreneurship after decades of playing it safe. She described trembling hands as she signed contracts, the unknown looming like a mountain, yet beneath the fear pulsed an exhilarating surge of growth. Her story sparked a challenge within me. Maybe true security arises not from airtight control, but from embracing the flux with openness. The contrast between her embraced vulnerability and my guarded predictability made me realize how stifling the illusion of absolute protection had become. That encounter lodged itself in my mind, prompting me to reflect on how surrendering to uncertainty might unlock a different kind of strength. One evening, the boundary between conscious thought and dreams blurred as I found myself envisioning a vast ocean hidden behind towering cliffs. For years, I had lived safe above the precipice, viewing the ocean as perilous, unpredictable. Yet, in that nightly reverie, I witnessed waves gently approaching the shore, inviting rather than threatening. It symbolized an internal invitation I had resisted, moving beyond rigid mental barricades into a realm where fluidity and adaptation govern. I realized I had been perched on the edge for far too long, convinced that safety demanded remaining distant, but the ocean beckoned with quiet persistence, offering both challenge and renewal. I decided to test myself by embracing moments of discomfort as doors instead of walls. Surprisingly, a simple choice to negotiate a better deal on an everyday purchase sparked a ripple effect. Where I once avoided confrontation, a flicker of assertiveness emerged, not loud or aggressive, but steady and intentional. Each small victory rewired my sense of agency, loosening old restrictions. I remember purchasing a piece of art from a local artist, hesitating because it was too expensive, yet choosing to prioritize value and personal pleasure. That transaction felt like a rebellion against ingrained scarcity, a tangible embrace of abundance in a world I had long perceived as scarce. The painting now hangs in my living room, a daily reminder that breaking cycles requires tangible acts, not mere intention. On another occasion, I joined a community group dedicated to financial empowerment rooted in storytelling rather than spreadsheets. Sitting alongside strangers sharing their struggles and breakthroughs added a profound human dimension. One woman shared how she overcame lifelong dread of banks by opening a modest savings account, her voice trembling as she spoke of reclaiming trust in her relationship with money. Her willingness to expose vulnerability shifted the room's energy, showing me how collective acknowledgement creates powerful ripples. This experience underscored the vital role of connection in dismantling invisible barriers, the way shared journeys light the path for individual breakthroughs. A particularly transformative insight arose when I caught myself bracing for failure, as if it were an inevitable visitor rather than a possibility among many. During a late-night conversation with my partner, I confessed my fear that stepping outside known patterns would result in defeat. She listened patiently, then shared a phrase I now hold close. Failure is not the enemy, stagnation is. That simple reframe cracked open my resignation, prompting me to imagine a life where risk and learning intertwine endlessly rather than being sealed off by dread. Our dialogue became a sacred exchange, bridging my inner doubts with her courageous optimism, reminding me that vulnerability and strength are not opposites but companions. I also discovered that environments profoundly shape how inviting change feels. Shifting from cluttered, chaotic spaces to rooms bathed in natural light and order offered unexpected clarity and calmness. The physical transformation mirrored an internal shift, opening pockets of mental space where fresh perspectives could take root. It taught me that external surroundings aren't mere backdrops, but active participants in molding our capacity to act. When I rearranged my workspace, allowing light to filter through sheer curtains, I noticed my mind breathing easier, ideas flowing more freely. Such seemingly small adjustments created fertile ground for breaking entrenched cycles. Reflecting on all this, I recognize a new dimension emerged. Liberation arises not only from dismantling fearful patterns, but also from cultivating nurturing environments, both inside and out. Reclaiming agency means creating sanctuaries of possibility where self-doubt cannot hijack decision-making. It requires inviting the unknown with curiosity and kindness rather than resistance. Through each tangible action, shared story, and transformed space, the once impenetrable fortress softens, revealing pathways toward a vibrant, expansive future. I encourage you to explore your own landscapes where such subtle shifts might lie waiting. The overlooked corners in everyday routines or relationships that influence how powerfully you engage with change. What might happen if you welcomed uncertainty not as chaos, but as a rhythm asking to be danced with? How might rearranging your physical or mental space invite new stories to unfold? These questions are not signposts for quick answers, but sparks lighting the way beyond paralysis into new horizons alive with possibility. I remember the moment clearly. I was standing at a crossroads, not on a map, but inside my mind. A place where old habits and hardwired reactions lived quietly beneath the surface. There was a restless tension, like the air before a storm, an electric charge humming just out of sight. For years, I'd sought to negotiate safety with invisibility. I tiptoed around uncomfortable truths, trying to shield myself from change by pretending paralysis was neutrality. But deep inside, something was stirring, a silent rebellion that demanded more. On this day, I chose to listen. That internal shift was subtle but seismic. Suddenly, I noticed how my automatic financial decisions often lacked any true intention, carried out instead on a loop of old anxieties and rehearsed fears. These weren't just background noises. They were the unseen architects molding my self-expectations and limits. What surprised me was how frequently I'd surrendered my power to invisible defaults, as if they held some sacred credibility. It was like trusting an outdated compass while wandering a shifting landscape, precisely when adaptability mattered most. Later, during a visit to a bustling city market, I encountered a vendor who shared his journey of rebuilding life after financial hardship. He talked not about spreadsheets or investments, but about learning to hear the whispers of his intuition amid chaos and uncertainty. His words resonated deeply. He described those quiet internal cues as beacons, urging him to break free from cycles grounded in fear and scarcity. His story illuminated a powerful truth. True change springboards from tuning into subtle internal signals instead of the loudest external pressures. It made me wonder how often I'd missed these signals while distracted by noise. That evening, as dusk painted the sky in hues of purple and gold, I sat on a worn bench watching life's patterns unfold through small, everyday moments. Children clung to their first scooters, wobbling uncertainly before finding balance. An elderly couple navigated the street with practiced ease, steady steps forged through years of adaptation. Their stories, fragile strength meeting the tides of change, spoke volumes. I realized that transformation unfolds through balance, through learning to sway with uncertainty instead of resisting it violently. This delicate dance, I thought, wasn't just metaphor. It was a blueprint for rebuilding how I approached my financial life. One morning at a quiet cafe, I pulled out a journal and began drafting a letter to my future self. I challenged myself to cast aside long-held fears, crafting statements of possibility that once felt alien. I'm ready to trust progress over perfection, I wrote. I will honor discomfort as a signal for growth, not retreat. Writing these words stirred an unexpected resolve. It was as if these sentences planted seeds rich with potential, able to germinate only if watered regularly through action and reflection. The practice became a new ritual, a simple but powerful act of affirming intentional change. Unexpectedly, a friend reached out with an invitation to join a community investing group. At first, hesitation gripped me. Old habits whispered warnings, but I recognized an opportunity to put new perspectives into practice. Joining that group became a turning point. Engaging with others who navigated risk and reward openly shattered walls of isolation and shame I hadn't known I carried. Their candid stories of fluctuations, setbacks, and triumphs revealed that financial journeys are messy, human, and fundamentally shared experiences. The companionship transformed unfamiliar terrain into a safer place to explore boundaries. During one lively gathering, I voiced a hesitation about investing in a startup idea, confessing my fears of loss. A seasoned member smiled and encouraged me to consider measured vulnerability as a strength, not weakness. He explained that when assessed thoughtfully, taking calculated risks connects us to growth in ways complete certainty can never match. That perspective reframed my outlook entirely. Instead of clinging to safety nets woven from avoidance, I began crafting safety lines built from awareness, support, and adaptability. It felt less like risking everything and more like charting a courageous path with intentions grounded in self-trust. As weeks passed, I noticed shifts rippling through daily routine. Small financial choices, like setting aside an unexpected bonus or negotiating payment terms, became opportunities to practice this new approach. Even when anxiety surfaced, it became a familiar companion rather than a tyrant, signaling areas needing compassion and recalibration. The balance emerged through these lived experiences, proving that breaking rigid cycles doesn't demand upheaval in one giant leap, but a series of mindful steps weaving together confidence and kindness. Now, imagine yourself at this point of inner reckoning. What might it look like to hear your own nuanced whispers, the subtle signals that urge transformation? Could engaging with your financial story through community and critique open doors you never dared knock upon? And as you walk this evolving path, where might you begin crafting intentional rituals, letters, conversations, small actions that nourish a new relationship with money, rooted in bravery and presence? Reflection combined with movement invites a gentle revolution, one that reshapes not only how you act, but who you become in this journey. A few years ago, I met a man named Daniel at a community workshop who completely shifted how I viewed the inner forces directing our financial lives. Daniel spoke candidly about his lifelong struggle with what he called invisible chains, patterns so tightly woven into his psyche that they seemed inseparable from his identity. What struck me was his description of these chains as holding more than just limitations. They carried a kind of emotional inertia, a built-up weight that made moving forward feel like wading through molasses. He told us about a moment when, exhausted by constant self-sabotage, he decided to confront this head-on by crafting a ritual that honored discomfort in a new way. He explained how every evening, before sleep, he would light a candle and verbalize the exact thoughts that prevented him from making decisions, whether it was fear of failure, feelings of unworthiness, or an overwhelming need for control. In those moments, articulating these barriers out loud gave them shape and form. They lost some of their vague power and instead became tangible, something he could negotiate with rather than submit to unconsciously. Hearing Daniel's ritual helped me realize that naming internal obstacles can be a gateway to transforming their hold, turning abstract fears into conscious challenges to be managed deliberately. Inspired by this model, I began a practice of my own, journaling late at night without judgment or expectation. What was surprising wasn't just the awareness that surfaced, but how a new emotional texture emerged. The act of writing allowed me to meet those difficult feelings with curiosity instead of combativeness. I started to see them less as enemies and more like heralds signaling unresolved needs or wounds beneath my financial behaviors. One particular entry emerged during a restless night. "I'm afraid I'll lose my footing if I take the next step." Writing this down didn't make me weaker. Essentially, it illuminated a crucial internal truth yearning for attention. On weekends following that discovery, I revisited places connected to old financial wounds. One was my childhood home, where money conversations were often shadowed by tension and silence. Standing in the kitchen where I once overheard hushed talks about bills and shortages, I felt how those early emotional undercurrents shaped an unspoken pact. Avoid risk, protect what little there is. Revisiting physical spaces linked to emotional history grounded my awareness in sensory reality. The worn linoleum, the faint smell of coffee, and anxiety mingled in the air. These visceral reminders deepened my empathy toward that younger version of myself and sparked a desire to rewrite the story from a place of compassion. Later that year, at a financial coaching session, a breakthrough unfolded unexpectedly. My coach suggested exploring the concept of emotional budgeting, the idea that beyond money management, it's essential to track how feelings influence where and why I allocate resources. We mapped out recent spending patterns alongside emotional states, uncovering that splurges often mirrored attempts to soothe boredom or prove self-worth, while frugality coincided with anxiety or a need for control. Recognizing this complexity added nuance. My financial decisions weren't simply rational economic acts, but embedded in emotional ecosystems I could learn to navigate. One memorable evening, I shared this insight with a close friend, Naomi, who nodded knowingly. She revealed how she'd struggled with a pattern of overspending as a way of reclaiming agency during periods of personal uncertainty. Her honesty invited me into a deeper understanding that these cycles aren't failures, but deeply human strategies for coping with vulnerability. We talked about steps we each took to interrupt these cycles, a weekly ritual of reflecting on emotional triggers, setting boundaries around automatic spending, and celebrating incremental progress. Our conversation felt like weaving a shared fabric of resilience, reminding me that healing is intimate but also collective. A particular turning point arrived in the middle of a quiet snowfall when I made an unplanned, symbolic gesture, donating a sum to a cause I believed in. It was a modest amount, but it carried an outsized meaning, a deliberate offering to shift my relationship with money from scarcity to generosity. That night, as frost etched delicate patterns on my window pane, I felt a gentle thaw inside. The act reframed money as circulation, energy moving to sustain others and renew myself, breaking rigid walls built from fear and scarcity. It became a tactile demonstration of trust in abundance, no longer confined to abstract hopes, but embodied real action. Now, consider how such intentional rituals might intersect with your own efforts to dismantle unspoken financial cycles. What if evening reflections, revisiting meaningful environments, or weaving emotional awareness into money management could open new doors of insight? Perhaps the pathway isn't in grand gestures, but in steady small acts that cultivate intimacy with feelings beneath the surface. Can you imagine narrating fears into clarity, tracing spending patterns as emotional maps, or exchanging stories with others to soften resistance? These approaches render the unseen visible, enabling conscious choice where once there was only repetition hidden in shadows. The moment I stepped into the dimly lit room for my first financial therapy session, I felt a mix of anticipation and unease swirling within me, as if I was about to unlock a hidden chamber in my psyche. The therapist's office was unlike the sterile environments I'd expected. Soft blankets folded neatly on a couch, books tinged with golden titles lining the shelves, and the faint scent of lavender filling the air. It felt like a sanctuary, a place where my tangled thoughts could untie themselves gently. Sitting down, I noticed a small glass vase with dried flowers, delicately preserved, yet resilient, and the symbolism wasn't lost on me. Here, I thought, is a space where vulnerability could become strength. Our conversation began with an invitation to explore nuances beneath my financial decisions, digging past spending habits and budgets to the emotional subtleties masked beneath. She encouraged me to reflect not just on what I feared, but what sorrow might be sown into my relationship with money. It dawned on me that grief, though unacknowledged, had woven quietly through my patterns. In flashes, memories surfaced. The ache I felt watching my parents argue quietly about bills in the night, the bewilderment of scarcity when wishes remained unfulfilled, the loneliness baked into silence around money topics. These emotional undercurrents had crept into my financial blueprint, shaping limits in ways even my conscious mind hadn't charted. As I shared these fragments, she introduced a metaphor that struck deeply: financial behavior as an ocean tide pulled by unseen lunar forces, not entirely under the sailor's control. Some waves carried currents of past loss, others tides of hope, but every swell shaped my voyage. This image nudged me to acknowledge that beneath decisions, beneath even the boldest gambles, lie invisible emotional waves shifting with roots in profound experiences. Understanding this, I began to see my money story not as a flat ledger of gains and losses, but as a composition of deep feelings moving beneath the surface. During one exercise, she guided me to close my eyes and picture a financial event that stirred complex emotions. For me, it was a promotion I'd once turned down because the salary increase felt insufficient compared to the anxiety it stirred. In the visualization, I rewound that choice and stepped into the moment with newfound awareness. I heard the internal voices not only of doubt, but also of past pain signaling, "Don't risk more." With eyes still closed, I softened toward these voices rather than silencing them. This moment of compassionate listening revealed layers of my psyche previously unexplored, showing me that my hesitation was fueled by protective pain, not weakness. Weeks later, a shift blossomed as I began journaling letters addressed not to external authorities but inward, to the child within who had absorbed unspoken fears. I wrote softly to that younger part. "I see you, the silent guardian of my heart, holding space against storms you never asked for." Releasing these words on paper felt like unburdening a secret safely carried too long. It allowed an emergence of tenderness toward myself that was surprisingly transformative. Within those pages, I found cracks forming in hardened defenses, little openings where healing could seep in. At a weekend gathering, I shared some of this work with friends who nodded in recognition, sharing stories of their own concealed grief around money. What I hadn't seen before was how collective expression created invisible bridges. Hearing others' voices normalizing pain and hope intensified my courage. One friend confessed how after years of financial setbacks, she treated each stumbling block as a letter from her past, urging her to pause, listen, and adjust her course rather than abandon hope. Our conversation reminded me that behind every aborted dream or cautious no lies a constellation of emotions needing acknowledgement, guiding us toward gentler resolutions. One evening, the air crisp and luminous with moonlight, I sat on my porch reflecting on how grief cocooned within financial habits had limited my capacity for joy and abundance. It was like clutching a faded photograph tightly, familiar and sacred, but preventing me from embracing unfolding moments. I resolved to practice a ritual. Each night, naming one sorrow linked to money and sending it out like a candle's flicker into the dark, releasing burdens carried in silence. Over time, the weight eased, revealing fresh space to invite possibility with an open heart. During this period, I discovered that the intersection of grief and finances is not a barrier to success, but an unseen current shaping the rhythm of growth. Embracing this perspective allowed me to navigate choices with a balance of courage and self-compassion, not pushing through denial, but leaning into discomfort as a guide. This approach transformed my relationship with money from a rigid battleground to a fluid dance of acknowledgement and intention. Imagine entering your financial landscape with this tenderness, the willingness to honor what has been lost without letting it dictate unwittingly who you become. Visualize those emotional currents beneath your actions not as obstacles, but as messengers bearing insight. What might happen if you invited your internal guardian of grief into conversation instead of confrontation? This is where profound renewal begins, in the sacred interplay between feeling deeply and choosing bravely. Reflecting on this journey so far, I find myself standing at the edge of something both familiar and unknown, as if poised on the threshold of a vast forest where shadows mingle with shafts of light. It's a place where the textures of what I've discovered begin to intertwine, weaving a tapestry that both confounds and invites. I can almost sense the subtle hum of transformation vibrating through the air, an invisible current pulling me forward while gently urging me to pause and consider the weight of every step taken. The experiences I've encountered feel less like isolated events and more like threads woven into a living fabric, where hesitation and courage entwine, perhaps inseparably. Each thread carries its own hue, sometimes deep and dense with old echoes, other times shimmering faintly with the promise of change. In quiet moments, I notice how these hues blend, creating patterns I had not anticipated, revealing contours of my internal landscape I hadn't dared to explore fully before. It's as though the map I once held, etched by habitual responses and hidden fears, is being redrawn in colors more vivid, more flexible, capable of reflecting complexities that defy simple categorization. I recall how, at times, clarity arrived unexpectedly, slipping in like a whisper carried by the wind rather than a shout. There was a fragile, almost elusive quality to this clarity, as if it required patience and stillness rather than force. Sitting quietly, I learned to listen, not for the loud declarations of change, but for the subtle shifts, the soft rustling of leaves signaling transformation underway. It reminded me that some of the truest movements happen beneath what the eye can see, akin to roots deep underground rearranging soil before any blossom springs forth. The tension between visible progress and hidden preparation created a kind of fertile liminality in which possibility could take root. In conversations shared, both inward and outward, I felt an awakening of sorts, a moment when the noisy chatter of automatic beliefs gave way to a voice more authentic, nuanced, and tender. That voice does not demand immediate action or perfect resolve. Instead, it gently invites an ongoing dialogue, a negotiation with the self marked by compassion and honesty. It acknowledges complexity without judgment and encourages exploration of the familiar patterns that have long shaped my choices. This internal dialogue sparked a subtle recalibration, a gradual loosening of tightly held certainties that, ironically, had promised safety but had often created constraint. There's a profound vulnerability in recognizing how many of these patterns have quietly directed the flow of my life, influencing the horizons I dared to envision and the risks I allowed myself to take. It's akin to realizing that the reins you believed you tightly gripped were, in fact, woven from fragile threads frayed by time and unexamined fears. Yet, within this awareness lies not despair but possibility, the chance to become an active participant in rewriting the script, to become the author rather than a passive reader. It's a space where the tension between caution and aspiration unfolds dynamically, urging me to consider what it might mean to choose differently from a deeper place of understanding. Walking this path has taught me that transformation is rarely linear or neat. Instead, it resembles the steady work of erosion and growth, where stones worn smooth and seeds sprouted unseen tell a story of time's patient hand sculpting change. Sometimes progress comes in spirals, circling back over terrain once thought conquered, revealing new layers and fresh perspectives. Other times, it bursts forth unexpectedly, like sunlight piercing dense canopy after a long rain. This dance between persistence and spontaneity embodies the unfolding rhythm that now feels inseparable from the process itself. I invite you to imagine yourself navigating this complex landscape, not as a distant observer, but as the traveler who carries both wounds and wisdom, both hesitations and hopes. As we stand together in this moment before what lies ahead, there is an exhilarating tension, a palpable energy in the air that carries both uncertainty and invitation. It whispers that the story is moving not towards sudden resolution, but towards something more profound, an awakening of choice imbued with intention and courage emerging from a deeper alignment within. In the quiet between breaths, I find a restless anticipation, a readiness to step beyond patterns that have long circumscribed the limits of experience. The air seems charged with possibility, as if the very ground beneath is poised to shift, offering pathways that beckon exploration. It is here, in this poised stillness teeming with potential, that I sense the stirrings of a new chapter waiting to unfold, one where old cycles may give way to fresh rhythms, and where the dance between fear and freedom finds a harmonious cadence, yet unheard. The day I chose to step beyond the familiar echoes inside my mind, I sensed an invisible weight lifting, though the path ahead remained shrouded in uncertainty. It was as if I had been sleepwalking through a maze, unknowingly circling the same walls, and suddenly gathered the courage to reach out and grasp a thread leading outward. That thread wasn't a promise of quick fixes or guaranteed success. It was an invitation into a quiet courage that whispered, "You have the power to rewrite the script." I remember how my breath slowed, how my heart opened just slightly, enough to glimpse a horizon I had scarce dared imagine, a life shaped not by repetition but intention. What unfolded after that choice was not a straight journey but a dance of light and shadow, revelation and hesitation. At times, I stumbled, confronted by older parts of myself gripping tightly to familiar comforts, even as they limited growth. Other moments gifted unexpected clarity, moments when doubts softened into questions, and I began listening rather than resisting. In that delicate space, I realized something profound. Transformation doesn't demand abandoning who I have been, but embracing all facets of my story: fear, hope, resilience, and inviting them into a new conversation. It shifted from a battle to a dialogue, a kind of inner symposium where every voice had a seat, and wisdom emerged from the interplay. A close friend once said to me, "Freedom isn't the absence of difficulty. It's learning to move through challenges with your full self intact." I hold that phrase close, recalling it during moments when old patterns threatened to reclaim the stage. It reminds me that breaking cycles isn't about perfection or erasing past wounds. It's about gaining enough awareness to choose differently, even when shadows linger. This kind of liberation carries tenderness, acknowledging that each step forward is both courageous and fragile, a balancing act that honors complexity without yielding to paralysis. I also discovered how vital gentle companionship is in this process. Those human connections that reflect back our struggles and victories alike. Sharing pieces of this journey with others dismantled isolation, revealing that the inner currents we navigate are seldom unique, but part of a collective dance. The stories exchanged became lifelines, threading hope into moments that could have otherwise unraveled. It became clear to me that healing is both deeply personal and inherently communal, woven through shared vulnerability and mutual witnessing. Looking back, I realize this awakening is less about an endpoint and more about entering a living conversation with ourselves and the forces shaping our choices. It's ongoing work, a flux that invites curiosity and compassion as daily companions. I see now that every hesitation, every small act of conscious defiance against repetition, carries immense power to shift trajectories, turning what once felt like an invisible script into a poem authored by intention and care. As I stand here today, I extend an invitation, not as a command or admonition, but as a gentle call to attention. Listen closely to the subtle rhythms guiding your decisions. Notice when patterns pull you towards safety at the cost of growth, and ask what new story you might write if you allowed yourself the grace to step forward anyway. This is not about grand gestures, but about embracing those small, deliberate moments where choice flickers alive. The power to change is quiet and persistent, rooted not in force but in presence and willingness. In this unfolding narrative, I find an abiding hope. Hope that our deepest selves can become allies in crafting futures that honor all parts of our journey. It reminds me that the hero we seek isn't waiting somewhere out there, but lives within us, awakening in the act of choosing differently, again and again. And so, we move forward, not because uncertainty disappears, but because we discover the strength to meet it, to dance with it, and ultimately, to transform it into the foundation of growth and abundance.